Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining this bipartisan group that has worked pretty hard on a matter of just fundamental importance. We're really happy with the vote on the motion to proceed, which showed some strong bipartisan support for a simple proposition that the nation should not be at war without a vote of Congress. It's as old as the Constitution of 1787, and it's based on a fundamental value that if we're going to order men and women to risk their lives in harm's way, it should be based on careful deliberation. I spoke this morning on the floor and I talked about these two Army sergeants who were just killed in Afghanistan in an insider attack last week. They were 28 years old and one of them had had 10 deployments already to Afghanistan. The other left behind a wife and 4 children. His grandfather was a veteran who was a POW in World War II. His father was a Marine veteran and he was killed and leaves 4 kids aged 2 to 7 behind. All of us visit VA hospitals, all of us talk to our troops and military families, and whenever we do, an impression that's left deeply upon us is the long and enduring consequences of war. And they're so enduring and so impactful that if we decide to go to war, we should do it based on careful deliberation. Some viewed this as, is it an effort to tie President Trump's hands? It's not really about President Trump. It's really not even about the president. It's about Congress. It's about Congress fully inhabiting our Article I role to declare war and taking that deliberation seriously. Some thought, well, maybe this will send a bad message to adversaries around the world. We don't send a message of weakness when we stand up for the rule of law in a world that hungers for more rule of law. When we stand up and say, on a decision this fundamental, we have rules and we're going to follow them so that we make a good decision, that's a message of strength, and it especially speaks to people around the world that are in the streets protesting in Iran and Iraq and Lebanon, Hong Kong and elsewhere because they want rule of law. But I'm just really happy that we have been able to work together as colleagues across the aisle to claim strong congressional responsibility. We want a president who will fully inhabit the Article II powers. We don't want a weak president. But we need a Congress that will fully inhabit the Article I powers. That's what our troops and their families deserve. And with that, I'd like to have Senators Lee, Senator Durbin, Senator Collins say a few words, and we'll open up and take some questions.
I appreciate what Tim Kaine just said, which I think is really important. This is not about the presidency. This is not about wanting a weak presidency or a weak commander-in-chief. This really is about the proper allocation of power between the 3 branches of government. If we can point to any one branch that has created the problem that's arisen over the last several decades, it's this branch, the one in which we work. It's the Article I branch. It's Congress. Over time, through atrophy brought about by lack of exercise of that muscle, Congress has ceased to be in the war declaration driver's seat, even though this was a really important feature of the Constitution at the time it was drafted. As Alexander Hamilton explained in Federalist 69, this was a distinguishing feature between our prior system of government, the one that was based in London, and the one that we have now. Under the old form of government, the king had the power to take us to war without Parliament. And then it was Parliament's job to figure out what to do about it, how to fund it, and so forth. The new system was designed so as to have an elected chief executive who would be the commander-in-chief but couldn't take us to war. That power would be left exclusively in the hands of those people most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals and more frequently than the President of the United States. It's not the President's fault that this has gone in that direction. It is quite to the contrary. The combination of Houses of Representatives and Senates of every partisan combination over the years gradually relinquishing power. This has been very good for some members of Congress insofar as they don't want to have to own any particular decision. They can either feign outrage or feign support when the president takes a particular action. But it's not theirs to own because they didn't declare it. This is a problem. Now, it's really a pleasure to stand with my colleagues who are up on the stage today. We come from a pretty broad spectrum of points along the political continuum. And this helps demonstrate that it's like many of my legislative proposals. This is one that's neither liberal nor conservative. It's neither Democratic nor Republican. I would add here, this is neither hawkish nor dovish. This is something that simply focuses not on whether war is ever appropriate, not on whether some action against or involving Iran might at some point become necessary or warranted. It focuses instead on the fact that moving forward, any action that we take involving Iran, given that it's neither authorized by the 2001 nor the 02 AUMF, needs to be authorized by Congress if it's not authorized somewhere else or authorized as part of the president's inherent power to respond to an actual or imminent attack on the United States. This should not be controversial. If you really look into it, it's not controversial. Now, I mentioned the political diversity on this stage, and there certainly is. Look, I am a big supporter of this president, and I support what the president is doing with our foreign policy. I have become a huge fan of this president's handling of his commander-in-chief power. I believe that more than any other president in my lifetime, this president has taken steps to avoid getting us into additional wars. Regardless, so I want to be careful in this part of it to say that I don't necessarily speak. I'm not empowered to speak for any of my colleagues, anyone but myself. But for me, this is about supporting President Trump in his foreign policy, in his effort to make sure that we don't get involved too easily, too quickly, and in an unconstitutional way in any war. This is entirely consistent with his policy, and I stand firmly behind it.
Thank you. Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Senator Kaine. We're here today to ensure the Senate fulfills its constitutional duty and responsibility in having the sole power to send U.S. troops into war. I use both of those words because I think sole power really means the duty and the responsibility. Article 1, Section 8 is explicit in saying the power to declare war belongs to Congress. Congress overwhelmingly reaffirmed this constitutional provision after the Vietnam War, which divided our nation, cost so many lives, and seemed to wind on indefinitely. We passed the War Powers Law in 1973 over the veto of President Richard Nixon to make it clear that in future wars, the American people would have a voice in the decision on going to war. Under the law, the President has the authority, as he should, to approve military attacks as a response to an imminent threat or with the expressed authorization of Congress. The Majority Leader has argued that the War Powers Law is somehow only relevant when thousands of troops are being deployed in a Vietnam-type situation. That was his argument this morning on the floor. Not a military action, the President argues, is simply a deterrence. Well, deterrence can be a slippery slope, and is exactly what this law has in mind, an escalation to war without express authorization of Congress. In fact, the recent briefing by the administration on Iran, which I know Senator Lee attended, was filled with echoes of previous provocations, vague assertions used to justify military escalation. It raised serious concerns about what we were being told about the justifications for our actions recently and perhaps in the future. We now have confrontation with Iran, which is at the heart of this effort. I don't know where this moves to next, and I hope that it is resolved without any further military confrontation. But the prospect of Iran deciding, and I hope they don't, to develop nuclear weapons could put us very quickly on a course where the constitutional responsibility of Congress is invoked. That's why I joined Senator Kaine in this War Powers Act effort. The Senate should not allow the country to be led into another Middle Eastern war without the constitutionally required consent of the American people through Congress. One word about responsibility. I've been a member of the House and the Senate. I have voted on efforts to send our troops to war. They're the toughest votes I've ever had to cast. You just know under the best of circumstances that Americans will die. And before you make that decision, you have to think long and hard. And many members of Congress would like to race away from that and say, no, I'd just rather blame the president if it turns out badly. The Constitution doesn't give us that luxury. We have the responsibility on behalf of the American people to face the realities, as Senator Kaine described them on the floor of the Senate this morning with the two recent casualties that occurred. I think it's important for us to accept not only this responsibility, but to acknowledge our authority. The Constitution's clear. Article 1, Section 8 states the power is explicit to Congress, as it should be. One should never send our sons and daughters into war without the consent of the American people. I've made the same argument throughout my congressional career, whether the president was a Democrat or a Republican. I urge my colleagues to join us in reaffirming this body's constitutional authority and responsibility in matters of war.
Senator Collins.
Thank you. First, let me begin by thanking Senator Kaine for his leadership, Senator Lee, and Senator Durbin for their hard work on this resolution. This resolution is much needed, and it is long overdue. As my colleagues have said, it reasserts Congress's constitutional role and recognizes that the framers did not vest in the president the authority to declare war unilaterally. Over the past decade, regrettably, Congress has too often abdicated its constitutional responsibility on authorizing the sustained use of military force. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution could not be clearer. It vests in the Congress the sole power to declare war. Although the President, as Commander-in-Chief, has the power to lead and defend our armed forces and to respond to imminent attacks, no president has the authority to commit our military to a sustained conflict. And it is, as my colleagues have said, important to reassert the legislative branch's role, regardless of which party occupies the White House. That has been my position during every administration, whether the president is a Republican or a Democrat. Indeed, in 2011, I voted with 10 of my Republican colleagues on a similar resolution that was directed toward restraining President Obama's attempt to enter the conflict in Libya. I've supported a number of prior War Powers resolutions, including an amendment to the defense bill last June. I do want to say that the regime in Iran should not interpret the recent votes in the House and I hope in the Senate as meaning that the Americans are divided on the president's constitutional prerogative to defend U.S. forces and American citizens around the world. Nor should the Iranian regime interpret these votes as a lack of resolve against its aggression and malign activities in the region. Nothing, for example, in Senator Kaine's resolution would require our Navy to cease patrolling the Strait of Hormuz, for example. But the fact remains that Congress cannot be sidelined in these important constitutional decisions. I salute my colleagues for joining in this bipartisan resolution. I'm encouraged by the vote to proceed, and I hope we will have a strong vote on final passage. Thank you.
With that, we'll take some questions. I do want to acknowledge a number of others worked very closely with us on this bill, including Senators Young and Paul. And the version of the bill that we just moved to proceed to was actually benefited by some drafting suggestions both Senators Collins, Senator Lee, and Senator Durbin were part of. So I just want to acknowledge that, please.
Senator, going forward, there's been talk about amending the War Powers Act to take note of some of the changes or some of the concerns about consultation, about this 90-day window. Where do you all stand on that? What do you think is doable? Is there a time window for doing something like that, particularly going into a presidential election?
I'll just say something quickly about it. Senator McCain and I had a bill called the War Powers Consultation Act that attempted to rewrite the War Powers Act to deal with some of the, some constitutional challenges that had surfaced from the very beginning of the act, and B, the changing nature of warfare from the mid-1970s. That bill was drafted with the thought that warfare was between nation states. What about non-state groups? That bill was passed, that act was passed before there were drone strikes and cyber attacks. Are those acts of war? So there are some conceptual challenges and questions about the way war is fought now that are different than the mid-1970s, and that's why I would support a rewrite of the War Powers Act to take those things into account. I think that's a longer-term project, but a valuable one. If others would want to say a word on that, please.
Thank you so much. My question is for Senators Lee and Collins. The House has also tried to repeal the 2002 Iraq War AUMF, and there is an ongoing fight in last year's NDAA, maybe this year NDAA, to defund offensive military action against Iran. Can I get your positions on both those two provisions, where you come down on that?
I've said for a long time we've been involved in a 2-decade-long war effort that is problematic. I've said for a long time I think we need to get out of Afghanistan, and I think we need to take a close look at any theater of war in which we're still involved. I'm not ready to make a comment or a commitment on any specific proposal moving through the House because I just haven't looked at those.
It seems to me that it is time to take a look at the authorization for the use of military force that was passed in response to the terrorist attacks on our country in 2001. It has been in effect for a very long time now, and we do need to reevaluate it. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be replaced, but we do need to reevaluate it.
Please.
Senator, the president looks increasingly unconstrained post-impeachment acquittal, and he's tweeted within the last hour saying that this resolution makes the United States look weak. I think you and Senator Lee both kind of addressed that theme in your opening remarks, but what is your understanding of the president's actual intentions with respect to the military posture against Iran right now, and where do you see this maximum pressure campaign that he's orchestrated headed?
Where it's headed is unpredictable. Remember, the president was very close to a military strike against Iran in June that he aborted at the last minute, a missile or drone strike. And then there was a period of de-escalation, which was good, but then we were escalated back up in December, early January to trading battlefield casualties. So I do think there's been a de-escalation in the last 6 weeks. That's a positive, but it would be overly optimistic to just expect that will go on indefinitely. So I think we're still at a tough posture with Iran taking actions that we don't like, and we're doing some things that they don't like, and so we're in a very tough posture right now. The president has, tweeted out negative things about the resolution, but what we noticed, many of us worked together last year on a similar war powers resolution dealing with U.S. participation with the Saudis in the civil war in Yemen. And we put a war powers resolution on the president's desk from both houses saying, stop these activities. The president did veto the resolution. We couldn't override it, but it changed his behavior and decision-making because he then told the military to back off on some of the activities. He didn't like Congress telling him what to do, but our feeling is when Congress stands up and acts, majority in both bodies, and puts something on his desk, even if he chooses to veto it and we can't override, the will of both bodies and the public that they represent, that is something that could well be a factor in his decision-making, and I hope that that's the case.
I'd like to say a word, if I can, on two things. First, the earlier question here. Having been one of the 23 senators who voted against the invasion of Iraq, I certainly believe that was the right decision then. Look at the situation we face today with almost 5,000 American deaths in the war in Iraq. We found no weapons of mass destruction. We enhanced, unfortunately, the image and efforts of Iran in the region, and it appears that many of the Iraqi leaders would like to see us leave after 18 years of this conflict. Having said that, before I pat myself on the back too much, look at Afghanistan. I voted for that. We're still there 18 years later. I had some conversations yesterday which were reported in the press that the president is trying to remove our forces from Afghanistan. I support the concept of bringing our troops home. I think we're all looking for stability in the process. And let me say on Iran, too, going to your point as well. When we asked in this briefing, and nothing that I'm about to relate is classified by my estimation, when I asked the justification for the Suleiman targeting, there was a suggestion that there was a threat to the United States, of some imminent threat of some sort that he was involved in. I then asked whether or not Congress should be called in for their authority, to use their authority to move forward from this point. And there was a pushback from the administration saying that would not be welcomed by the troops. It would hurt morale. I couldn't disagree more. I've had conversations with our military leaders. The uncertainty of American popular support of our military effort undermines the confidence of our troops in their offering their lives for this country. When we step up as a Congress and say we stand together as a nation, we're asking you to serve our nation. I believe they go into combat with a much stronger feeling that they are really executing their best abilities on behalf of the United States and its future. And the President, last point I'll make is the President has said publicly, if Iran moves forward on nuclear weapons, there will be an answer from the United States. I'm not certain what that means. I don't know if that means something in the territory of Iran or not, but that is the complexity of the issue. It's just not as simple as the President makes it in his tweet as to whether or not the American people or the people around the world view us as weaker because we're following the express wording of our Constitution.
One last question, please.
Yes, Senator. Your resolution as written, I think, says directs the President to withdraw troops from
Hostilities.
And I think the President would say, well, we're not engaged in hostilities with Iran. So how do you see this resolution actually working practically if it were to be decided into law?
So sort of technically about the War Powers Act, the definition of hostilities is very precise, and it was clear in drafting it that it included ongoing hostilities or imminent hostilities. By the time we got to the place at the end of December where we were trading battlefield casualties, an American contractor was killed at an Iraqi base. The U.S. then took military strikes against Iranian-connected militia positions, 5 different positions in Iraq and Syria, killing about 24. Then there was the Iranian support for the embassy protest in Baghdad. And then there was the U.S. strike against Soleimani, also killing an Iraqi militia leader and parliamentarian. And then there was the response from Iran that caused, we're now finding, injuries to 100 American troops at the Al-Assad Air Force Base. When you're trading those kinds of battlefield casualties back and forth, the question of whether there's hostilities or not has been answered. In order to get the privileged status for the resolution today, we had to demonstrate to the satisfaction of the parliamentarian that the definition of hostilities in the War Powers Act had been met, and it had been met and then some. Hopefully, we are stepping back, and I like that the last 6 weeks, for some different reasons, both on our side and on the Iranian side. Iran's having to deal with intense internal protests by young people who are saying, why are you lying to us about the passenger airliner? Why aren't you using the resources to help us grow an economy of opportunity for people instead of using it for misadventures abroad? There's been a couple of reasons that have caused some step back, but I don't view that as something that we can just relax and take for granted. We are still at a very challenging moment in the U.S.-Iran relationship, and this assertion by Congress to a president that if you think it warrants going further, that can only happen with us. I think the time is right for that. Listen, thank you so much. Do you want to say something, Mike, on that one, please?
I'd like to respond briefly to the last question that was the second to last question. I haven't seen the tweet. I suspect, based on the context as you described it, that what the President might have been saying was that insofar as Congress undertakes any action that indicates an unwillingness to take a tough position with regard to Iran, that might weaken our position relative to Iran. That's not what this is about. In fact, I think what the American people and what the entire world will see from the debate that we're about to have in the Senate surrounding the Kaine resolution is that there is abundant support for the United States taking tough positions with regard to Iran. And that as part of that, we want to make sure that any military action that needs to be authorized is in fact authorized properly by Congress. That doesn't show weakness. That shows strength. And I think that's the strength that's going to unfold as we debate this. The President of the United States wants to make America great again. There are those in the military-industrial complex who would much prefer to make America Great Britain again, in the sense that they would much prefer to make it much easier for one person to take us into war. Fortunately, our president doesn't want that. Fortunately, our president is not a warmonger. Fortunately, our president is, in my view, the least hawkish, the least war-prone president I've known in my lifetime. And so this is entirely consistent with his objectives. Thanks.